I'm extremely excited to have three great panelists on stage who have been schooling me backstage and hopefully will give you guys a lot of great insights. And I'm just going to sort of turn it over to them quickly to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the conversation.
I'm Toby Joe Budro. I am a partner and the CTO of a company called Control Group. We build things for people, including a bunch of like web and sort of digital platforms, but a big bulk of our work includes HIPAA projects in the cloud, so we have to deal a lot with topics of privacy at a very literal and prescriptive way. And then we also do a lot of work with building intelligent spaces and intelligent devices and like physical interfaces. So that's all driven by sensors, and so we have to deal with questions of identifiable and non-identifiable personal data all the time.
My name is Susan McGregor. I'm the Assistant Director for the TAU Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. Prior to coming to Columbia, I worked at the Wall Street Journal, where sort of got started in privacy and security in the What They Know series. And since arriving at Columbia Journalism, have been doing a lot of work, research in privacy and security, particularly as it relates to sort of the needs of journalists and source protection.
I'm Matt Hogan. I'm co-founder and CEO at a company called DataU. We're a startup out of WeWork Labs down in West Soho. DataU is a personal data exchange. It's a platform for consumers to aggregate, see, and sell their own personal data. The premise being our data is out there being sold left and right, and we get very little for it now. So if it's going to be out there anyway, you may as well be the beneficiary of its value. Privacy is a really kind of a nebulous word, and the way we think about privacy isn't necessarily about putting up walls and gates and barriers and creating gardens. It's more about having the key stakeholders being able to channel data and channel the corresponding things along with data reputation, identity. Then, again, the chief stakeholder being able to channel where that should go, who it should go to, and also be the recipient of that value.
Excellent. So I'm just going to sort of throw this out to set a little bit of context for this conversation. I'm just sort of curious why are we up here having this conversation? Like, what are the big issues that you guys see sort of driving the importance of data, this sort of definition of privacy, and why now?
I guess since Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald just landed in the U.S. for the first time since the Snowden revelations, I could say that. I mean, I think that, one of the things that this is definitely true in the journalism world, and I think it's actually true more generally, and why this is a broader topic, is the gap between sort of expectations and existing understandings and what's actually possible. So part of the reason why I got more into this work myself was when I started understanding the legal frameworks around obtaining data from companies, and realizing that many of the assumptions that myself and my colleagues had about what constituted communication systems that we thought were private, and we saw this play out. We saw this play out after Occupy Wall Street, and sort of who owns your Twitter data? Is it yours? Is it Twitter? And legally, who has standing around that? And so I think it's that there's something very important that we all have learned over the last 20 years, let's say, about just because you're sitting in front of your computer alone in your house doesn't mean what you're doing is private. And what we're seeing is that even it goes much beyond that, right? In terms of, it's not just that when I post something on a website, it's not private, but it's also that even the act of doing that, the process by which it gets from me to that endpoint, is also importantly not private. And I think that fundamentally that doesn't jive with many of the expectations we have about existing systems, and sort of how we feel, to sort of Matt's point, how we feel we should have control over these things, and maybe are discovering we don't.
So, I think when there's a famous Eric Schmidt quote where he says, it was actually back in, I think, 2005, he said it, where every 2 days we create as much data that existed from the dawn of civilization until 2003. And it's an interesting quote because it doesn't, you think about the way we all act, we go to a restaurant, we go buy something, we do all these things. We've been doing that forever, right? Like the behavior hasn't necessarily changed. It's just more about everything's being tracked now. So, I used to go to the bar in 1962 with my friends. Now I just check in on Foursquare. That's a data point. I used to have thoughts. Now I spew them out on Twitter, and that's a new data point. I used to have a preference for something. Now I say like, and I like something. So it's because of all this data that's being created. I think we're sitting up here to try to find out. It's inning number one as far as figuring out, who, I use the word ownership very loosely, but who owns the data, who controls it, what it's worth, what are its uses, who has access to it, and it's really trying to set up a framework for kind of going forward, because I think, largely we've seen so much benefit coming from a world where everything is being tracked and everything is, kind of digitally available, and there's a lot to be gleaned from it, but it's really about, setting the right kind of guidelines and framework, going forward to make sure that the right entities and the right players in each seat are getting the right attribution and the right allocation of value across the way.
I would add that some form of us will probably be sitting here doing this, I hope, endlessly, because privacy especially isn't just about some moment, that this conference is happening. And a lot of the things like explicit publication or sharing, or about tracking, those are side effects. Those are secondary to a bigger issue, which is all of the signal that we bleed out constantly, whether it's tracked or not, whether we attach some meaning to it. And if we do, the message we put in that little envelope creates orders of magnitude more information as it's on its way to its destination, as it's being originated, as it's being recalled, as it's being stored, logged, processed, aggregated, looked at for recommender systems. Every time there's an access, every time there's even an attempt at access, more data is created. So privacy is a really slippery thing, and one that I hope doesn't start and stop with the conversation today. But we know when we're sharing something, we know when we're posting something online, that we're at least giving license to that thought, to go somewhere. But independent of that, when we're just checking email on a hotel Wi-Fi, when we're just walking through a room with something in our pocket, I build systems that see that and sense that and respond to that, and serve targeted ads to you or open and unlock doors for you or things like that. So there's a lot of bleed that's going on all the time. So the conversation around privacy is bigger than just data. It's also that our thumbprints, our fingerprints we're these sort of glowing, throbbing messes of signal at all times.
I'm curious maybe Matt, I can throw this out to you, as just as you're building the system and you're obviously having conversations with consumers as well as people who potentially are going to be purchasing that data down the road, what do you get as a sense of what the general awareness is from people in those conversations?
Yeah, I think, so for people in the audience, we're in beta right now. So we've been testing with a bunch of users and talking to potential data purchasers and lining up this kind of two-sided exchange for data. There's a little bit of selection bias with our user base, because there's certainly people who care about data, personal data, privacy, and they're kind of first adopters. So, they're obviously aware, right? They came to our platform, they found us because of this awareness. But I think, a better proxy for kind of the general masses out there and the awareness, I think there were a lot of events kind of leading up, maybe since, it's hard to kind of pinpoint when it was, but you think about things like the Obama administration announces the Privacy Consumer Bill of Rights in 2011. WSJ puts out the What They Know series. That kind of brought a lot of awareness. There's Senator Rockefeller and the FTC started investigating, I think, 9 of the top 20 data brokers. In 2012, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think ad blockers, whether it's Disconnect or Ghost3 or Adblocker Plus or one of those kind of browser extensions, are, I believe, the most downloaded browser extensions among U.S. adult using internet using adults. Sorry. It's a late one last night. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, so all these events have kind of led up, and then of course Snowden, and the NSA and PRISM revelation kind of blew the doors off, right? So if you weren't, people had a general awareness of what was going on as far as like tracking, and kind of the easiest way to illustrate that is, that little Balenciaga bag that follows, women around the internet, or my Nike shoes that follow me around the internet. There is awareness. It didn't mean that people were cognitively saying, I know exactly what's happening, but there is this awareness now, and it's. I think it's time to be having this conversation because of all those events and because of the watershed moment that Snowden, kind of provided for everyone.
So I'm interested in sort of now taking that sort of piece and putting that in looking at it from the perspective of a company or a brand or a platform that has access to all that information. And I think what we're sort of getting at is, what is that like who's responsible, number one? Like, should we be holding the builders or the companies responsible for how this data is being handled? Should they be educating consumers? What's the sort of ethics behind some of these interactions?
I mean, I would say that, the first and foremost thing is to understand. I mean, I know because I come also from a programming and development background, and there can often be a tension between the enthusiastic part that's like, let's build a thing, and then the parts that's like, well, how should we be building this thing? And I do think that there's a responsibility on the part of companies. I mean, companies there are legal sort of open legal avenues for requesting this information. So we see companies like Google with the transparency report. We know that these requests are possible. They're legally mandated. You have to respond in a lot of cases, in almost all cases. And I think it also has to do, I think there's enormous value to the consumer. I think there's a real opportunity to, especially as we now have the concrete awareness, and we've started to see consumers really make some active, if not always super informed choices about, looking to use communication apps that are, theoretically preserve their privacy better than sort of existing solutions. And I think the key thing is to define and meet expectations, and to say, if you are requesting data for your app, let's say, to not only say we'd like this information, but to make really clear in that moment what you're going to use it for, right? And I think that there are many cases where we see, in fact, there have been some studies that have shown that if you show people how you're using their information, they're much more willing to share it. And so that if I see that your app is requesting my contact list, if you can kind of give me a sentence that frames why that's useful, what the value is to me, because again, I think people are starting to realize that a lot of that they realize their data is being collected. They know it's being sold. So if you want it from me, tell me what I get for it from your product and from your company. And I think in that level of transparency, there's an ability to establish trust and establish a strong relationship, a stronger relationship with your consumer.
It's really tricky though, because there isn't necessarily the vocabulary for the discussion between companies and consumers, just for that, the brand and consumer model. And if there were, it couldn't include, it would be impractical to include the full breadth of the information that's shown. So if a mobile application wants access to your contact list, there is a lot of, there's the obvious data that they're pulling, right? There are the obvious uses right now. They're hamstrung if you somehow have in a TOS or in a legally binding agreement that only the explicit thing that you said you were going to use it for will be used at that time. You can't add features. If you had some application and you wanted to be able to share a piece of content with a person from a contact list, and then later you want to add a feature that lets you share with multiple people, if you had been too prescriptive in that initial statement, you wouldn't be able to do that without going back to the consumer and asking for yet another permission. So what ends up happening are these roll-up blanket permissions. I switched to Android from iOS for my personal device last year or so, and it's shocking sometimes the number of permissions that are requested, but also as an Android developer, I know how almost pointless those permissions are, because they're so high level, they're flyover, they don't really mean anything. So you don't have an opportunity temporally, the vernacular isn't there to really agree to much of anything. And even if you did, it would be for the time-limited scope, of a product life cycle of the features that we know are there now. But when you look at like private equity coming in and taking over a company, that license that you granted to that information is an asset. And whether or not someone lets go of that, later on to someone, anticipated doing that the whole time. If there's a takeover, if part of the NCAP, the net current asset value, is derived from license to data grants that you've given, then you can be sure that someone coming in to buy or to reinflate a company is going to find opportunities for doing that. There's also that discrete pieces of information have a certain value, and agreeing to a purpose has a certain value. But once you index and start correlating and aggregating, there's different value there. And what you may have given in the value exchange for that one discrete thing, it may be orders of magnitude more valuable when combined with lots of other pieces of information. I think that part of the Snowden narrative that's interesting to me is that no one I've talked to, and this is like the sort of Fox News loving relatives on the wife's side to coders that I work with, no one was shocked. No, you can't name a single piece of information that anyone is shocked that a company has seen or has access to. What was shocking was that there was one viewpoint, the NSA's viewpoint, from which all of it could be seen, or at least that's sort of the specter, that all of it could be seen. And the reason I find that interesting is that when you plot it over time, that perspective is going to be forged. Once you cut these things different ways, over time, there are going to be lots of perspectives, with access to huge amounts of your cross-service information. ISPs, everywhere in the transport path. When you look at a typical page load on a website, on a modern media site, there's no less than a dozen, 24 different companies, from content distribution networks to ad trackers, to, all sorts of services, the like button, that they all see that request happened. This is you saying like, hey, WebMD, what's this mole mean, right? And now like dozens of companies know that you asked about that.
And then you've got a giant mole.
Yeah. Did you, God
for a friend.
forbid you upload something, but did you, could you ever explicitly grant to all of those parties? Would you want to? And so there's a fatigue that sets in really, really quickly. The bar is really low for those kinds of permissions. And, more and more I think that people don't want to have these conversations, people on the consumer side. The Snowden thing, the reason it was so shocking to people is that they can put themselves in the NSA's shoes, or what they imagine it to be, to see a narrative that could shake out. But when they're thinking about like a CDN, serving an image, and there being like a user agent string, that's not really that telling. But when you think about it from one of the longer term perspectives or wider perspectives, it can be a very different situation.
Just to follow on for what you said, you mentioned before about this, hopefully this conversation is kind of ever evolving. We'll be having it in 20 years and 40 years and 60 years and so forth. And I think that the conversation around, this ever evolving conversation around permissions and apps and TOS and juggling consumer expectations and consumer psychology and, the needs of the business and efficiency of the application itself, I think that's ever evolving too. And you see, app developers who may get a little bit too aggressive with their impingement on either user rights or privacy or one thing or another. And there's consumer backlash or the FTC backlash, right? So Path had built, the path of the application was pulling, user contact lists and not really telling the user about that. And, people found out and there was some backlash, and all of a sudden FTC, Julie Brill raises her hand and says, no, you can't do that. So I think there's, it's kind of, in some ways it's a little bit scary operating in a world where there's such a kind of a minimalist legal framework around personal data and privacy and what that all means. But at the same time, it's a little bit refreshing because it means that we're solving the problem as developers and businesses and consumers going back and forth.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like part of what I completely agree about the fatigue, because every time I now of course I pay very close attention to it, and if I'm downloading like a QR reader, I'm like, okay, well I have these 3 options, and what's each of them asking for, and trying to see if there's a way I can minimize my exposure through that, or in that moment. But I think that's, I mean, I guess to your point, Toby, I think that's exactly why I see there being potential value to companies in helping manage this efficiently for consumers, right? Because they don't, I don't want to make a million decisions all the time, but, I think I was having a conversation last week, it's like, if I could pay for email that, was going to provide me notice if my records were requested, I would do that. I would pay for that service, and I think that there are a lot of models where we see, consumers are willing to part with their money to get certain kinds of problems taken care of, and especially because something like privacy is, because there is this sort of data bleed that we see happening all over the place. The idea that I, can sort of have a relationship where a trust relationship where I can say, listen, I want you to take care of that for me in this realm. I think that would have enormous appeal to consumers. So I think there is a real opportunity there, a brand opportunity and a business opportunity to make that part of the feature set and make that part of the pitch, that this is something we can take off your plate with obviously, with some, within the realm that it's possible for a particular product or a particular thing,
Yeah, and
that is troublesome or difficult.
The default, for a very long time, and probably now, especially when you have brands creating utilities, services, apps, things like that, in service of marketing, I was CTO at Barbarian Group for a long time. I worked in this area a lot, making things for brands, and a lot of times the tendency was, let's go ahead and get what we can, we may need it later. And the truth is, it's very rare that anyone needs anything or finds a way to use it, especially brands who, are not going to make even a sports tracker or something, and then need all of the possible things you could collect. Laser targeted pieces of information that you could communicate very easily, the narrow scope of it. There are certain things that you can benefit from a lot, but the tendencies to just grab everything is a really naive tendency from the brand's point of view these days. I think that there are certain companies that most people on the street would assume don't sell information. And if you think of like Google, who are they going to sell information to? Apple, who are they going to sell information to? You don't worry that they're going to sell information. But implicit in that is this sort of prejudice that we all have, that even if we agree to it, there's two classes of companies, those with whom you don't have to worry about that, and the rest. And I think when you're a brand especially, and it's not a lottery ticket. You're not going to find some $100 billion company because you pulled extra, friends list or something. It's never happened. So if you took advantage of that point of view and that prejudice and said, we're only going to do this and you can completely and categorically trust us, I don't even think you'd have to charge for it. I think you could build a huge amount of brand equity right away just by saying, we're not like them. We're in the Apple category. We're not like those other companies out there. Because a lot of people do think of this. I mean, everyone here who's built a product is probably guilty of it a little bit, right? Of like, maybe later someone will buy this if I have that extra stuff in there. And it's just, if you had the yacht, you wouldn't be here today probably. So like, it didn't work, right?
I was just going to say that I think that part of that, right, has to do with also the mythology and the conversation around big data, right? Big data is going to solve everything. Big data is going to give us. And speaking, in my sort of very limited experience, when I was still at the Wall Street Journal, and because I was a sort of technical producer as well as, I was in the editorial space, but working with things like, ad targeting and things like that, and what always amazed me was that we collected so much information, nobody ever looked at it.
Yeah.
And that the reality is that, if you have, just to sort of reinforce the point, if you're really going to set aside the resources to hire the data scientists and, take the time to sift through that stuff, maybe you might get it, but the chances are, you're not going to hit that $1 billion idea. You're not going to put that investment in which case there's, I think, much more value to be had by doing as Toby suggests and saying, look, we're going to take these two pieces of information because that's what we need, and we will guarantee you we're not going to do anything with the rest of this. And I think especially in this moment and moving forward, that has an enormous amount of value to the customer that can really, and frankly makes your life easier, right? Because you don't have to worry about collecting and storing and the liability and all the other things that come along.
The liability is huge.
I think
Yeah.
the legal pendulum is swinging, towards data minimization at this point, where it's such a liability to have vast amounts of data that are either you're not using, or you're just collecting for the sake of it, and more and more, whether it comes from regulation or just kind of cultural societal swing, I think people are going to say, look, it's actually a tremendous liability to have this data that I've gotten no discernible value from. Let's just not collect it anymore. Let's not use it. But interesting, you made a good point, Toby, that I think from a brand perspective, going forward, there's a tremendous opportunity. If you think about good stewardship of data in the light of, under the lens of kind of, green or organic, or this is kind of the new thing. I think there's a really big opportunity, for brands to kind of raise their hand and say, you know what, all these other guys are out there and they're gobbling up data and they're giving nothing back to the consumer and they're just getting rich off the data. We want to work with the consumer around their data. I think that would really engender a lot of trust. And probably a more accurate data product at the end of the day, and a more efficient market, where you have a consumer who's kind of part of the equation as opposed to the consumer who's constantly suspicious and trying to throw up walls and barriers. The way it's been set up so far with brands and kind of enterprise having all of the tools to monitor us, and us as consumers having really no tools to either monitor or face outgoing vendors, that's created this environment where it's almost like an addict who the only way to satiate their addiction is to continue to march toward getting more and more granular data and more impingement upon user privacy. And at some point that crosses an unacceptable line, and I think we're either at or close to or have crossed that line. And that's another reason why we're kind of sitting up here, because there's brands need to figure out what's it going to look like in 20 years. There may be a hit this quarter in profits, or there may be a hit in one way or another if you kind of cut off that data spigot. But if you're building for the future, you're building a longer term product, and you're going to have more longevity as a business.
So, wow, I get to talk. These guys are like amazing. But I'm curious. Like we looked at this sort of pay for privacy type model. And then we're looking at this sort of these more transparent opt-in, more targeted practices as being like potentially this like big competitive advantage. I want to touch on just a little bit about how you're thinking about with DataU this sort of idea of now we're going to create a real exchange where data suddenly is being treated as a new sort of asset class. And what are the sort of the conversations that you're having as you're building that marketplace up right now?
I think it's good to frame it under the auspices of it being an asset class, and it's been talked about quite a bit, and World Economic Forum wrote about it, and data is the new oil of the new digital economy, and all these things. And if it is an asset, the way we think about it, it's like, is there any other industry or sector out there where arguably the chief stakeholder of an asset, right, personal data, I mean, it's kind of my asset. I know that other people have access to it, right? So if I swipe a debit or credit card, that merchant knows who I am and they know what I purchased. They have the ability to use it too, but I would say that I'm probably the chief stakeholder in that transaction of that asset, and I have literally no seat at the negotiating table as far as what it's being used for, what it's worth, who's doing things with it. And that's kind of why we're building what we're building. That kind of, I would say that fuels a lot of our thought process around building. It's a steps process to get to where we want to be, but I think the long run is when you have kind of a cross section of your data in one place, you're able to deploy it in so many different ways, and that's where we want to be in the long run. Right now, if I said, Scott, what do you do with your data? You'd say, well, what do you mean? What do I do with it? I signed up for 30 platforms, and I have 5 to 10 devices at home, and it just kind of exists in all these different places. You can't do much with your data without a vehicle or a tool, and that vehicle or tool needs to aggregate it so you can start to use it. So that's kind of a lot of what is driving our early build and the way we're thinking about the world.
So as we sort of part here, maybe just like one final question that I'll throw out. I'm just sort of we've talked a lot about how potentially that relationship between consumers and brands or businesses is beginning to change, and where we'd sort of like it to head. If we're all around 20 years from now, what do you think how do you think that relationship will change, or what is your hope for the next conversation that we have? Is that too tough of a question?
I mean, I think in a way we're sort of, as Toby mentioned earlier, I think that if we're still having the conversation, right? Because I actually don't think that people's notions of privacy in their sort of internal sense has probably changed that much. But the mechanisms by which we communicate, the way that we do things has changed, and so we have to have this conversation over again, and that will continue to happen. And I think it really has a lot to do with kind of, sense of individuality and personal dignity and all of these other things. So, I'm sure that, whether we start, having implanted chips in our heads, or look even in places today where you have to show identification to purchase anything. There are places where, where you can't get a cell phone without, having your identity attached to that SIM card. So, there will continue to be frontiers of this, and the more that we openly discuss it and kind of establish as a society, maybe as a world, kind of what we think is important to preserve about that, we'll keep having it on platforms, in times to come.
Yeah, I think if there's a chance to change the sort of Wild West around privacy, it's going to be either a result of like OSI layer security, so more widespread use of message layer encryption and decryption, better management of keys, so that if you're posting Facebook status, maybe it's encrypted, they can decrypt one time or something, and then if it's recovered in the future, hopefully those keys would have maybe expired or something like that, so that you don't have to worry about the long-term post, like the secondary and tertiary owners or accessors of it. That combined with, as much as I hate to say it, better governance, at very least better dialogue and awareness from the judiciary to the legislative. It's a common joke, the sort of Luddite role of people making huge decisions on there's Ted Stevens and everything. And I think that it's not a solution, especially when you look at like black hat access, but reasonable expectations of privacy, the objective viewpoint, the one that that the state would have to adhere to, they really haven't been updated that much. The most controversial non-digital cases that I know of are around like cars, because they have windows on all sides. When you think about like that right now, if I go get my laptop right now and just run one tiny little command, I can start harvesting every MAC address in here, every BLE transmission in here. And it's trivial to do. I could put detonating devices somewhere that just when your MAC address is nearby, they do their thing. So there's a lot on the black hat side that governance wouldn't protect you from, but I think that it could at least help set the white hat world up in the right way, and maybe that would push out as a side effect the awareness, the investment in, and the tools around message layer and transport layer encryption that aren't like the horrible nightmare of OpenSSL that we're seeing right now. And there's almost no message layer encryption anywhere. And as someone who has done a lot of work for brands, I can tell you how many plain text, storage mechanisms there are out there for huge brands, because something was done by little shops 15 steps removed from the brand as their ad agency got themselves in yet another bind and had to farm out the work to soloists who do it on the weekends. So that's the person who's got like 7 projects going on in addition to their full-time job. That's the person who's making the decisions on how to store information a lot of times. And better governance, as much of a headache as it would be, could help spread the tools at least, the awareness at least.
Yeah, as I say, better, not necessarily more always.
Yeah, I don't know.
Smarter, not.
I can't picture a version that I would like, but I'm thinking of any force that could roll out awareness and mandates. I do a lot of HIPAA work, and it's not perfect, and electronic medical records aren't perfect, but there's a huge awareness because the penalties are steep if you don't adhere.
So as far as your question around our relationship as consumers with brands and what we'll look like in 20 years, I tend to think it'll be much more collaborative and kind of a more symmetrical two-sided exchange. It'll be far less antagonistic. I think that you're seeing evidence of it already. A lot of us are on Amazon, and we have this great relationship with Amazon where we like getting their recommendations, and they're using our data for good. And I think largely most commercial enterprise is typically using the data for good, and in the sense that they want to make profit, and that tends to be, that results in a good thing for us, right? Because they want to give us the best product, they want to give us the best experience. As far as with government, that's a little bit of a different animal. I don't want to tackle that, but I really do believe that you're starting to see the tip of the spear with brands kind of doing right by data, and as they continue to include the consumer more and more in the conversation around privacy expectations, data, and kind of the whole morass, I really do think it's going to be much more collaborative, going forward.
All right, this panel's getting ready to self-destruct. Toby, Susan, and Matt, thank you so much. Guys, help me thank them.
Thank you.